Welcome everyone. We're just letting people in, so it'll take a 30 seconds or so just to make sure everyone's in the room. Right, I think everyone's been let in. Really brilliant to see you all this lunchtime. I'm Georgia Gould. I am the chair of London Councils and the leader of Camden Council. And for anyone who is kind of wondering exactly what London Councils is, we're a collective of the 33 councils in London, including the City of London, who come together to take on some of the big shared challenges we have, from tackling the climate crisis through to lobbying around local government finance. And I think there's probably the biggest issue on all of our lists at the moment as councils is the financial challenge we face. We at this current moment are all facing the reality of a cost of living crisis and the huge need we're seeing in our communities, and councils really are a safety net for those who are struggling and making impossible choices between heating their homes and feeding their families. And councils are providing really important support. We're seeing rising demand on services, and we're ourselves seeing those inflationary pressures, which mean we're in a really difficult position of having to think about reducing services just as demand is increasing. And as we all know, that sits on top of long-term reductions in funding for local government. And we've all been, anyone who's been a councillor for a while will have been through the difficulties of trying to reduce spending and the pressure that we're seeing on budgets. So today is really an opportunity for us all to come together to look at that financial challenge. People will have different kind of familiarity with the range and complexity of local government finance. So we'll kind of start, I think, with an overview of how London councils, as in London boroughs, are funded, and then focus in on some of the specific challenges that we're facing at the moment, and the lobbying points we're making, some of which have been successful, some of which we're still pushing collectively and cross-party. So thank you so much for taking the time. These are relatively new, these London in Brief series, and we really appreciate feedback on how you find them. And we would like, there'll be a kind of short presentations, and then we opening up to questions. So if you use the Q&A chat function to put in your questions and say which local authority you're from as well. So I'm going to hand over to our speakers for today, starting with Paul, who's the Strategy Director responsible for local government finance and improvement at London Councils. Paul, over to you.
Many thanks, Councillor Gould, and welcome everyone. I'm the Strategy Director for Local Government Finance and Improvement at London Councils. I'm joined by my colleague Paarthiban Sriranjan, who's the Head of Local Government Finance, and we're going to talk you through, hopefully fairly briefly, a set of slides that give a brief overview of how local government is funded. So we'll have as George said, there'll be a range of levels of understanding of the system. So I'm going to do a bit of that, which will be a recap for some of you who are a bit more familiar with the system, as well as how it's changed in recent years. And then Paarthiban's going to look at the here and now, the big pressures you're all facing, and what we were saying ahead of the autumn statement a few weeks back, and then a bit of an outlook in terms of what happened in the autumn statement and what's coming up, ending on a bit of a reflection beyond 24-25. So without further ado, what do we mean by local government finance? I sort of went back to the very beginning here and looked at the overall level of spending in London this year. So boroughs plan to spend about £32 billion across London in 22-23, and that breaks down. It's about £20 billion of revenue expenditure in the general fund in total, about £9 billion of capital spending, and about £3 billion in the housing revenue account. Now, while the HRA is quite small, it represents about a third of national spending. So it is quite important because London boroughs spend about 20% of the capital expenditure nationally and about 16% of overall general revenue expenditure. But what we tend to focus on when we talk about local government funding, local government finance, is the core spending bit, so the spending on core services. So of that 20 billion, there's around 4 or 5 billion on housing benefits and around 6 billion on schools, which councils are responsible for, but effectively that gets passported through councils. They have little control over how most of that money is spent. So the £9 billion of spending on core services is what we'll be focusing on in this presentation, which isn't to say there's lots of pressures in both of the other areas on capital and HRA, particularly during the current inflation cost of living crisis. So how does that £9 billion break down in terms of funding? Well, it's about 40% comes from council tax, around 30% from specific grants, and around a quarter, just over a quarter, from business rates, retained business rates. And that, if you look across London, well, if you look, I'll just flip back, if you look nationally, it's about 50% from council tax. And if you look at the shire areas, counties, districts, it's about 60%. And there's a range across London. The outer London boroughs being slightly more in profile, like county councils, more dependent on council tax for their funding, whereas this is a general rule in London boroughs and the areas with traditionally higher levels of deprivation. So some of these are outer London boroughs with more deprivation, have more reliance on grant income and retained business rates. Now, in terms of course, so the government's core term for overall funding is called core spending power, which you may have heard before, you may have picked up, you may be familiar with, but that represents around £8 billion this year in London. So of the 9 billion we talked about earlier, about 8 billion of that is within what the government deems core spending power. And this is a term that's been around for a decade or so. There's a couple of big grants outside of that. One is the public health grant, it's about £700 million, and homelessness prevention grants, 150 million. But largely speaking, what is within core spending power is council tax, it's about half of it. There's about £2-3 billion of retained business rates and revenue support grant, which is the general grant, and that's what we call core funding. You've got baseline funding there, which is essentially the government shorthand for how much funding boroughs should be retaining in business rates. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And then you've got a number of specific grants which total about £1 billion, but the two big ones there are to do with adult social care, the Improved Better Care Fund and the social care grant. And that's what we'll be receiving we'll get confirmation of in about a month or 3 weeks' time when we get the local government finance settlement. But that's the overall picture for England and for London. And what's happened to core spending power over the last decade or so is that it's been cut by about 22% in real terms. At one point for London boroughs, that was closer to 30%, and in the last couple of years, it has begun to come back up. So it's still over a fifth lower in real terms than in 2010, as you'll all be familiar with. And over that time period, London boroughs have about 800,000 more residents than they had back in 2010. So I just wanted to reflect, during that time period, there's been a number of changes to the finance system, and I'll pick out a few and make a few final remarks. But probably the biggest shift was in 2013-14. I mean, prior to that, in 11-12, we had the introduction of the New Homes Bonus. And then we had council tax support localisation and 50% business rates retention in 13-14. Some really big changes to how councils were funded. And all of this was a shift away from what we previously had, which was a system of formula grant, which was itself funded by business rates. But it was a grant that was based on an assessment of need and equalisation for what you could raise in council tax. And all of a sudden, from 13-14 onwards, we now have a system where there's some incentives introduced by the coalition government around how you might retain more funding. So within the new homes bonus, essentially the principle was if you build more homes, you add to your tax base, you get an additional grant. For council tax support, when that was localised, there's an incentive there to improve your local economic conditions and reduce the number of claimants of that benefit, and therefore retain more council tax. And the bigger incentive, probably more direct one, was around business rates retention. And now, since 2013, councils who grow their tax base in terms of their business rates get to retain a share of that growth. The problem is that we've not had any change since that system was set up, and the baselines, both on the business rate side of it, so the government's target level for every council for what it expects them to raise in business rates, and the funding side of it, i.e. the amount of funding they deem they should have left after you've done some equalisation for areas that can raise more business rates than others. That none of that has been reset, so we're kind of in a system now that is creaking at the seams, and reforms are long overdue. So there'll be some parts of the country that have become much more deprived since those baselines were set. Some that will become less deprived. Some whose population would have grown hugely, and some who now are retaining a lot more funding because of growth in business rates than others. So it's long overdue a reset. And I think there's two more major points I'd make about the way the system is currently set up. One is that social care has been repeatedly propped up in the last few years. So this chart just shows the number of it shows a number of different grants and funding streams, but essentially you can see the increase in ring-fence funding for social care within local government since 2016. So there was hardly any before then. And then from 16-17 onwards, you have the adult social care precept, which is a certain percentage on council tax that you can raise. That's been going up and up. The blue bar, you've got the two big grants I mentioned earlier, the Improve Better Care Fund and Social Care Grant, and then various other top-ups in between, of which we'll come on to in a minute, another one in the autumn statement. But about £14 billion by the end of 24-25 within core spending power that will be ring-fenced for social care. And this just shows the same over that period, core spending power, the grey bar at the top, more and more of it is becoming kind of siphoned off to fund social care specifically. The other key takeaway from this chart is just to say that we're becoming ever more and more dependent on council tax within this system, since 16-17 in particular. And I think back when core spending power was first coined as a term, it was probably about 40% of funding came from council tax, and it's now about 60% in that time period. And just the final slide is sort of how sustainable is that reliance on council tax. So the first half of that kind of decade of austerity, the government actually incentivised councils to freeze their council tax. And then from 16-17 onwards, we've seen almost the active incentivisation of increasing your council tax. And that obviously gives you a local decision, often a difficult decision locally, particularly in the last few years with the cost of living pressures we're facing. Another reflection there is that England slightly higher in terms of the increase in council tax compared to London over that period. So that was a very brief run through of how the system is currently set up and a few of the issues with it. And now we'll have a lot of time at the end to talk through some of those if you want more detail. But now I'm going to hand over to Paarthiban to talk through some of the current pressures and the funding outlook from here onwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and hi everyone. So Paul's just talked you through some of the changes to the local government finance system in recent years. So the first thing that I want to cover is the key funding pressures facing boroughs at present. The first four on this slide are sector-wide issues, and the second four are issues that have had a particularly disproportionate impact on London. So let's take a closer look at each one individually. If we start off with COVID-19, the legacy of the pandemic in terms of demand for services has continued into this year. especially for adult social care and children's services, and that's continuing to put a strain on boroughs' finances even before other pressures are factored in. Next, inflation. So the financial impact of inflation is significant for boroughs this year, and that's generally something that's been echoed across the entire sector. Adult social care. So the whole sector has been grappling with hugely complicated and resource-intensive reforms. There's an interplay between high demand from the pandemic and a huge NHS backlog that's putting a significant strain on the adult social care sector. As well as this, inflation is driving up costs for care providers, and there's also the impact of inconsistent approaches to health and social care funding by integrated care systems. Next, if we look at dedicated schools grant, so that's the main source of income for the schools budget. Local authorities previously have received a special dispensation from government to ring fence any deficits on their dedicated schools grant fund, instead of offsetting those deficits against their general reserves. But if that dispensation isn't extended, London boroughs face deficits of between 300 and 400 million pounds, and they would have to use their general funds to cover it. Next, if we come on to homelessness pressures, so that's a particularly big issue for London boroughs. London overall counts for around 60% of England's total temporary accommodation numbers, and the current cost of living crisis and extreme pressures in the private renter sector are driving up homelessness numbers very quickly. At the same time, the government is seeking to reform the homelessness prevention grant, which would see an overall reduction in London's share of funding, and that's something that's really concerning us at this point in time. So next, if we come on to the housing revenue account, so borough housing revenue accounts were already under big pressure from previous reductions to rents and additional fire safety costs, and now inflation is having a huge impact on repairs and maintenance costs. Independent modelling that was conducted by Savills suggests the capping of social rents could cost boroughs around £100 million next year. Next, if we come on to asylum seekers and refugees, so the end of the Afghan resettlement scheme and the Homes for Ukraine scheme have seen an increase in the number of refugees presenting to local authority temporary accommodation and homelessness services. While we can't accurately model the financial impact of that at this time, we do know anecdotally that it's causing significant pressure on frontline services. Next slide, please. So prior to the autumn statement, the scale of the financial challenge facing London boroughs was the largest it's been since 2016. So London Council surveys boroughs annually on their medium-term financial plans, which is effectively their budget over the next 3 to 4 years. The findings from the latest survey that took place between July and October this year show that the funding gap for London boroughs has increased to around 2.4 billion, which is the highest it's ever been. And of this, concerningly, 700 million falls into next year. One thing to point out is that the overall funding gap is entirely driven by demand-led pressures, so inflation, pay, and a rising demand for services. And that comes against a backdrop of boroughs forecasting funding to stay relatively flat. Next slide, please. So I think the important thing to point out here is that it's a sector-wide issue and not just something that London is experiencing in isolation. So these are some of the articles that have made the headlines recently, and it's clear to see that everyone is saying the same thing. The sector is facing significant financial uncertainty at this point. We've also been very active in our lobbying recently too. Next slide, please. So I think one thing to point out is it's not all doom and gloom. we're all pretty used to seeing local government at the bottom of the league tables when it comes to funding, but that wasn't the case at the recent autumn statement. So this graphic outlines how local government fared against other government departments in terms of the difference between funding confirmed at the last spending review, SR21, versus the funding confirmed at the recent autumn statement. And it's clear to see from this graphic that local government and the health and social care sector were the main winners at the autumn statement. Next slide, please. So what are the key headlines for local government finance at the recent autumn statement? I think overall, we need to say there's a welcome increase to local government funding. Government has listened to us and our lobbying has been effective. But if we go into the kind of individual announcements specifically, the first is council tax limits were increased by 1%, and that provides boroughs with additional revenue raising capability. But it remains to be seen whether council tax rises are the solution. It's incredibly difficult to justify increasing council tax during a cost of living crisis. Next, the postponement of the adult social care funding reforms. That's something that we lobbied for, and that's really welcome. And it's good to see that funding has been put towards addressing social care demand pressures. Linked with that, there's 8.5 billion that's been made available to fund social care activity over the next 2 years. That's 2.8 billion the next year and 4.7 billion in 24-25. And then business rates compensation of £1 billion each year for the next 2 years, and that's been confirmed for local authorities, which is very helpful. Although notably, the compensation is linked to consumer price index inflation and not retail price index inflation as in previous years. So these measures could considerably reduce the £700 million funding gap that London boroughs are facing next year. I think slightly concerningly, we could have a £100 million cut to the housing revenue account, as the 7% cap on social rents that was announced means boroughs will have less time to spend on maintenance, building safety and retrofit. And this cut could hit some boroughs particularly hard. So long-term solutions are still needed to provide a sustainable local government finance system. Government has again chosen the path of short-term sticking plasters for adult social care, propping up business rates through grants and relying on council tax increases. However, there's also a small glimmer of hope in the devolution trailblazers that were announced in the Greater Manchester and West Midlands regions. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Paarthiban, I'm already on it.
Oh, sorry, apologies. So overall, at the autumn statement, around 8.8 billion of additional or repurposed funding was made available to local government for the next 2 years. That's 1.8 billion of funding from council tax increases, assuming council tax raise their assuming councils raise their council tax capacity to their threshold. There's 5.4 billion of new and repurposed adult social care funding, and £2 billion of business rates compensation over the next 2 years. So we believe that the above funding could erode the estimated 700 million funding gap for next year by as much as 500 million, and that could go a long way to alleviating pressures in 24-25. Next slide, please. So I think it's clear to see that government has listened to the sector and plugged some gaps for the next 2 years. But I think it's important to point out that there remains significant uncertainty beyond the next 2 years. The key events and reforms that we've kind of listed here that will have a major impact on the financial health of the sector are going to be so spending review 2024. Spending reviews are government-wide reviews of all public spending that usually cover a period of 3 to 4 years. And the next spending review will determine the overall control total for government expenditure across the UK. Next, there's going to be the Fair Funding Review, which is also known as the Relative Review of Needs and Resources. And that is going to overhaul the current system of local government funding and determine how local government funding is distributed more fairly to councils across England and Wales. So that was first promised in 2016, but it was delayed indefinitely, partly due to the COVID pandemic. The government recently confirmed that no fair funding review would take place in this spending review period, i.e. over the next 2 years. Another key decision to be made is the future of business rates retention. So currently, local authorities keep 50% of any growth in rates collected in their area above those projected. That is subject to a levy from government, which is used to fund a safety net for local authorities who experience a significant fall in their business rates income. So one thing to point out is London is currently part of a shadow pool aimed at trialling whether we collectively can keep a larger proportion of our business rates income. And I think the final thing to point out on this slide is adult social care funding reform, which we mentioned earlier in the slides. The overall sufficiency of funding available for the reforms has been called into question. This is hugely important given that adult social care is the largest area of spend for councils and one of the most high profile. So what are the key conclusions? I think it's clear to see that government has listened to the sector, but there are a lot of big decisions still to be made. There's a cliff edge of uncertainty that exists currently for councils trying to plan their budgets for the next 2 years and beyond. And we're currently primed for the provisional finance settlement to be announced in the next 2 weeks, with a policy statement outlining the government's key policy intentions due to be released ahead of that. But in the background, there's loads of pressures affecting the sector. But inflation and the cost of living crisis are by far the biggest issues boroughs are dealing with at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a full and detailed presentation. I've not had loads of questions coming through so far, which I think suggests that there's just a lot of information to digest there. So just to everyone who is watching, please do use the Q&A function to share your questions. I know there's been one about whether slides will be available, and we'll make sure that they are. And there's also this whole conversation will be up on YouTube, so you can rewatch at your leisure. So just while people are thinking about questions, I wondered, Paul, if you could say a little bit about, I suppose, the broader opportunities for reform. And I know, one of the big questions for us is in local government is, given that the increasing strain on council tax that has been set out, there's probably a need to look more radically at the whole system. And I know London councils we've started a little bit of work on that. So it'd be good to get your reflections on what is the case for looking at some wider changes in funding and having that conversation with government.
Thanks, Georgia. Yeah, I mean, as I painted in my slides, it's long overdue, the funding system, and we're not going to see much of that soon. So what we're doing now is thinking about what would we want to see in the finance system as to how it should be reformed. All those parts, if you go back to that pie chart at the beginning, council tax, specific grants, and the retained business rate system, the central government has full control over most of that. Even council tax, which is the one tax you really have any say in, is capped. And so what we need to do is probably think about how, within each of those parts of the current system, what are the arguments for how local democracy and accountability can actually determine how funding is actually raised and spent in a more efficient way than it has done to date. Part of that picture with more and more funding being pushed, emergency funding being found for adult social care in the last few years, is because of the centralised way it's done and the central kind of top-down system we have. So So that, there's a real rationale for updating and thinking about new ways of doing things. And I think there's an opportunity with what the government set out in the Levelling Up white paper, with missions to 2030, to think about, how do we want the system to be funded by, the end of the decade? Because if you look at that picture over the last decade, we've had spending cuts, changes to the system, which have arguably left it, more centralised, under more strain, and actually quite untransparent in some parts of the system. So we're, as George mentioned, we're thinking about how we refresh our thinking on this going into the next year or so ahead of a general election, and then also thinking about that period beyond that, the general election to the end of the decade.
Thanks, Paul. And Sarah's come forward with a question that actually relates to the next thing I was going to ask, which is about pressures on the HRA. I think everyone can see the question, but for me, this is, I think, where certainly in my council we're seeing the most extreme pressure. I think the fire safety works that are absolutely necessary that we had to do, but they're largely unfunded, so councils have picked those pressures up, and there has been in my view, a kind of underfunding of kind of decent homes type interventions that have meant that there is a real need to invest in our stock. And because of the caps on rents, it was meant to be a self-funding system, and maybe Paarthiban and Paul can talk a little bit more about how it's kind of meant to work and how that came about. But that only works if local places are able to kind of respond to that and set rents accordingly, or are kind of supported centrally where there's a need for greater investment. And I think we did see a reduction in income over a period of time, and I think there's enormous pressure on councils to do everything that needs to be done around damp and mould, fire safety, other improvements, building new council homes, and the level of need that we're seeing. So I think it is truly a really dangerous situation within our HRA budgets. But I don't know who wants to go first, but handing back over to kind of say a little bit more about the kind of separate the separate nature of housing revenue accounts and the pressures.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this kind of self-financing system again, I think, over the same period since 2013, and councils have to have kind of a 30-year plan as to how they deliver that balanced HRA whilst kind of maintaining the stock they have. And then within that period, the government, rather than raising rents in line with CPI plus 1%, which is what it's supposed to go up by, were actually cut during the period. At the same time, there's additional pressures in terms of the burden of fire safety, and now obviously highlighted by the tragic case recently, there's going to be a big focus on damp and mould, and so all those pressures are at the time when materials, repairs and maintenance budgets are being put under lots of pressure because of inflation, and there are very few levers within that HRA to actually deal with those pressures, and with the government had to do something on social rents, I think, because given the nature of where CPI inflation was, and so the fact that it's been set at 7%, that's going to be a cut. It will help some of the poorest people, but it will be a cut to funding in an area that's really important.
Thank you. Paarthiban, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, nothing from me.
And then there's been a question about funding for children's social care, which I know is increasingly under pressure in the same way as adults, and it links to some of the work that London boroughs are doing to support those who are seeking asylum, particularly unaccompanied asylum seeking children. So it'd be good to kind of reflect on those pressures as well.
Yeah, so children's social care is the second biggest area of spend after adults, and prior to the pandemic, it was fast becoming the biggest pressure for most boroughs, not all, but a lot of our discussions 2 or 3 years back were about the really big pressures in children's social care. And that ranged in lots of different places. But it's a different story in different boroughs. But unaccompanied asylum-seeking children was one of those big pressures for certain boroughs. But broadly, it was a mixture of things, but to do with the rising costs of adolescence, and there's a particular cohort around kind of youth violence, which is really, really difficult and high cost, but also more and more complex cases, which I think drives up costs as well. Linked to, Paarthiban mentioned that the issues we have within schools funding high needs budgets, children with special educational needs and disabilities, and the legislation around that, which is has a knock-on impact on children's social care budgets. And so that was one of the big pressures, and adults, because of the extreme pressures on the NHS and the reforms, has almost kind of taken a lot of the headlines, and rightly so. But children's is still a huge pressure, and the funding in the system. So part of that social care grant can be, so that's ring fence for adults and children's social care, which I think is helpful. One of our problems with that, or one of the concerns with that, is that the way that's distributed actually only uses the adult social care formula. It doesn't recognise children's social care need. And if you look at the numbers from a purely statistical point of view, London boroughs receive about 15% of the adults formula, but about 25% of the children's formula. So there's kind of and my point about transparency earlier is that it's a decision about how that funding is distributed, but it impacts, it's probably a couple of £100 million by 2025 that would come to London boroughs if it was distributed in a more equitable way. So yeah, children's is a huge pressure, not really abated because of the pandemic pressures, and so when we said the autumn statement has helped, it has, but there's still really, really big pressures for next year because of inflation, cost of living, and these underlying demand pressures that haven't gone away.
Thanks, Paul. And I've got Kamala, who I think has put their hand up, and so I'm going to bring you in to kind of speak verbally. And if anyone else would rather speak rather than type, then put your hand up. And then we've got another question in the chat. So Kamala. Just unmuting you at the moment. Sorry, it takes a second.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I couldn't use the chat, so that's why I had to.
No, you're very welcome to speak. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these presentations. It's very good. Just taking the adult social care spend. I mean, I'm a new councillor, so I'm still learning the ropes, but I do find there's a lack of transparency and accountability in the reporting. I mean, roughly, I don't know how the other councils compare, but we spend nearly £36 million. This is not the SEND budget. The SEND budget is about another £30 million on which we've overspent. About £36 million on about 91 children. Now, the 91 children obviously don't receive that £36 million. But it's a whopping amount of money which has to be funded from council taxpayers who themselves are struggling, to keep afloat. But and yet, when I go looking to see how this is reported and how transparent it is, it's virtually impossible to find out where this money is going and whether these companies are actually registered in the UK even. So I'm just wondering, the other side of funding and getting the money and getting it all sorted is actually reporting and monitoring and scrutinizing and challenging, because in certain areas the budgets are almost sacred. It's a free pass. They just overspend, they overspend. Whereas in other areas, like say road sweeping, we'll go to the upteenth length to sort of make sure, we'll rather cut road sweeping contracts rather than sort of thing. So I just wondered, as I said, I'm new. I hope I'm not babbling on too much, but I would like to see how this aspect, the twin wheel of accountability, transparency, reporting, responsibility, value for money, how is that exercised against securing funding? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So this is, I suppose, a question for each borough individually, but also for us, you know, as London councils. I think we've got a really important role in both sharing best practice, but also looking across data from different boroughs and, you know, picking out some of those issues as well. But I'll go to Paul to respond to that, although I suppose it's less in your area.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one. Each borough will have their own way of doing things, but you know, your accounts are supposed to be able to show where all your spending has gone. You know, there's the statutory requirements to how you lay out your accounts. But you know, the world of local finance is complex, and there's not a lot I can say beyond that in terms of London Council's approach to this, other than what you said about increasing focus of an increasing amount being spent on a smaller group of people, which echoes what I was saying about complexity of need. So it's not really, I could say it's not part of our remit, but it's certainly discussions I have with treasurers. You know, children's and adults are the biggest areas of expenditure. They're also the biggest areas of risk, you know, reputational risk for you as well. And that goes hand in hand with being, you know, having those big budgets. And so, yeah, it's certainly part of the discussions we have with our treasurer counterparts about the things that keep them up at night and the things that they focus on.
Sorry to come back, follow up.
Oh, sorry, Kamala, we've got other people.
A very brief question. I mean, in that vein, can we not make use of more the Cllr reporting model, which, you know, and make it standardized and encourage all councils to follow a best practice in reporting and monitoring? Because at the moment it seems to be so varied, it's hardly standardized, and it's not really user friendly for the stakeholders. So I'll shut up now. Thank you.
No worries. Paul, do you want to briefly respond to that?
I mean, yeah, we do look, I mean, as part of our work we do on improvement and as part of the work of the London Innovation and Improvement Alliance, they do look at financial resilience and you know, how money is spent, as well as provision in children's social care. But we'll take that away and perhaps come back to you.
And I was going to say that, of course, like you said, you're a new councillor, but as a backbench councillor, you have a really important role in scrutiny, in looking at these kind of issues through the scrutiny process. And I'm sure that we're going to have other conversations focused on scrutiny in the future, where we can get more deeply into those questions about how to provide that effective scrutiny at a borough level. We've only got 2 minutes left, but I just wanted to quickly respond to the question on lobbying for charges to go up by higher levels, and there's a question about how adult social care budgets break down. So you've got 1 minute to respond briefly to those questions.
Or should I take the question on sales fees and charges?
Sure.
So London Council's recently held a session with chief execs and treasurers across all London boroughs on financial resilience. And one of the kind of main ideas that was kind of banded about in terms of how we can offset the increasing pressures that boroughs are facing was maybe increasing sales fees and charges as a potential way of doing that. But I think one of the main kind of concerns was it's very difficult to increase sales fees and charges by anywhere near the levels required at present, given the kind of current cost of living crisis. Similar kind of story with council tax. And I think around the lobbying point, I think there is scope to do so, but we kind of need to, I guess, pick our battles a bit and think about what the main issues are and what the main kind of wins that we need to achieve are. And maybe like increasing sales fees and charges is probably one of the kind of lower priority issues.
But I think that there's some more fundamental questions we've been looking at, like, you know, in some countries there's an overnight levy for people who, you know, tourists who stay either in an Airbnb or in a hotel, and that's something we've been looking at for a while. And I think we're going to be exploring as part of the kind of fiscal devolution work that Paul mentioned earlier. So I think those suggestions, and if anyone, you know, we'll continue to present back about how that work develops, but we're any ideas are very welcome. Paul.
I missed the question, but was it how does social care spend break down? So it's roughly, we know that in London, more is spent on younger adult working age adults than older age, and actually that's the same across the country. So when everyone thinks about social care, they often think about the elderly, but actually it's more than just that. There's people with physical, mental health and learning disabilities as well that all fall into those categories. So that shouldn't, we shouldn't forget that in terms of overall spending, that boroughs spend more on that cohort than the older age, and actually that's the same nationally. It's not quite as reflected in shire areas, but actually that's a national trend. So we often, as part of our distributional lobbying, we need to make that point repeatedly, that actually it's not just about old people. You need to consider those other factors that drive up demand in those working age adult areas as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And that is well, 1 minute over, so that's all we have time for in this session, but I hope everyone found it useful, and this is such a huge issue. I'm sure it's something that we'll come back to in sessions like this. So we'll share the slides, and please do give your feedback, because these are a new way of trying to make sure we're connecting with councillors across London. So I think you'll get a feedback form after this, so please share, and we'll make sure that they're or try and make sure that these are as helpful as possible. But yeah, huge thank you to Paul and Paarthiban for their insights, and for everyone who gave up their time to be part of the conversation. Take care.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.